All right, we got The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 20, Between Europe and China, 1500 to 1750. Got Section 2, The Safavid Empire. Let's go to our map real quick to get an idea for where we're talking about. So last section, 20-1, talked about the Ottomans, which are here in the green. 20-2 is the Safavid, which is this orange landmass right here. So we're talking about this particular area. All right, I'm going to outline it here. Is the Safavids. They rule this this particular area. The Safavid Empire is where the modern-day country of Iran is located. And in fact, one of the most significant historical contributions that the Safavid dynasty did was it did a lot to really create a separate Iranian identity. Right, a separate Iranian identity in a lot of ways. The origins of the empire date back to Ismail. We might call him the first ruler of the Safavid. Of the Safavid. And he granted himself the title of Shah, which, kind of like Europeans took the title king. The Ottoman rulers took the title of Sultan. Iranian rulers assumed the title of Shah. So we might just call this is the title for the emperor. And like we had mentioned before about Iranian identity, that's really what one of the most significant contributions of the Safavid is giving that identity. The Safavid dynasty and Ismail founded it on Shiite Islam. More or less, when you look at Islam as a religion, there are primarily two branches. So this dates back to the Prophet Muhammad and the debate and really argument and wars over who would be the rightful successor to Muhammad. You essentially had two groups, the Sunni and the Shia, or sometimes also called the Shiite. Same thing. And these two sides, dating back, maybe 700 to 800 CE, around that time period, debated over who would be the proper successor to the Prophet Muhammad. The Sunni more or less believed that the rightful successor was kind of like a more open door, whereas the Shia believed that it was primarily Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, who was the rightful successor. So we might say about Ali, the Shia believe he, and then we might say son-in-law, also cousin, so blood relative. Shia believe that Ali, he, son-in-law, is the rightful successor. And these two branches, Sunni and Shia, split all the way back in this, between 700 and 800, and led to the development of two different branches of Islam. Ismail is promoting the Shia version, which really becomes the dominant religion in Iran as a result of the Safavid dynasty. So of course, that's one of its most significant contributions, is establishing that as a majority religion. Now, it's important to take note of that within this split, and we'll go ahead and just kind of mark it off here, that most of the world's Muslims belong to the Sunni branch. So we would say that the Sunni make up about maybe 85% of all Muslims, whereas the Shia make up only about 15%, give or take. However, when it comes to Iran, and especially the Safavid dynasty, that's where most of the world's Shia Muslims reside, not just then, but even today, right? Even now. And it was during this dynasty with this distinct religious identity, Shia Islam, coupled with a different language, so the Persian language, whereas the predominant language in the Sunni world, or especially in the Arabic world, was Arab. Persian was more commonly spoken. Art differed. So, for example, the color blue, especially turquoise, turquoise blue, was more common with some of the architecture. And, the Shia Islam was founded, based off of a long history of tradition and religious ritual. We might say different rituals between Sunni and Shia. Right, so we can start to kind of get a picture of how Iran, again, develops this different identity. So one, it's political, right? The Safavid dynasty is a political unit. It is religious or religiously different. Again, still Islamic, but believing in this, the kind of minority branch of it, Shia Islam. It is a different language that's spoken. It is a different art style, right? We might add architecture. And it's different customs in terms of religion or religious practices. And all these things together make Iran, different than really their other Muslim neighbors, either to the west in the Arabic world or even to the east in the Mughal dynasty. One more key term that I want to define here is this notion of the hidden imam. This is related to the story of Shia Islam, especially what they call Twelver Islam. And that is the belief that Ali, who the Shia believe is the rightful successor to Muhammad, that his descendants, 1, 2, 3, right, all the way down to number 12, that 12 then went into hiding. Right, and this is where the hidden imam. Imam is a title for a religious leader, essentially is what an imam is. And the belief is, and the story is, that the 12th descendant of Ali, the rightful successor to Muhammad, went into hiding sometime in like the year 900 or something like that. And that scholars of Twelver Islam or Twelver Shia Islam believe that one, either the Imam will return one day to resume or take his role as the true leader of the Islamic world, or two, that perhaps it's up to religious scholars then to kind of fill in for where this hidden Imam is, and perhaps he will return, but for the meantime, other scholars ought to take this kind of role. So you have kind of a divide within some of this religious community, you might say. Some believing that the religious leaders of the time should take a more proactive role in politics. Others who say, well, you should wait for the 12th Imam to come out of hiding and return. And you see that play out over the Safavid dynasty. By far, probably the most significant ruler to the dynasty was Shah Abbas I, ruling from 1587 to 1629, creating a capital city of Isfahan. So this was the capital of the Safavid. And the book talks a little bit about how that compares to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, right? Istanbul, which is the capital of the Ottoman. So some comparisons between these two capitals. A difference was in architecture. In terms of architecture, the capital of Isfahan, and especially the residence of the Shah, had what we might call a royal, we'll call it a courtyard. You can actually see it in this image here, right? A giant grassy area. The architecture is also a little bit different. You can see some of the blue. Actually, I want to point this out here. This kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the differences in art styles. This blue tile, or this turquoise tile that you see right here, very, very, very unique to the Safavid dynasty and to Iran. You don't really see it anywhere else. used in mosques, for example, where you do see it very frequently there. So architecture was a little bit different between Istanbul and Isfahan. In terms of streets and how the cities were laid out, they were both pretty, so we're going to put different, right? They were pretty the same in terms of streets and how they were laid out. The streets were mostly made for walking. Very frequently, there was no wheeled vehicles on these streets. Not a lot of room. Not very centrally planned. A lot of these streets were just kind of narrow and not easy to navigate. The status of women, for the most part, in both of these areas was pretty similar, although especially in the Safavid dynasty, women were rarely in public, and when they were often dressed in the veil, covering from head to toe. However, Islamic law did grant women certain property rights that, for example, in some European legal systems, women didn't have those type of property rights that Islamic law granted for women in both Isfahan and Istanbul. In terms of cosmopolitan, cosmopolitan means, like, you might say this, ethnically and linguistically diversity. That's kind of a good way. Cosmopolitan means just kind of like urban, city. But what we really mean by that is, when we say cosmopolitan, is like worldly, that there are people from a lot of different parts of the world that reside in this area, that there are a lot of languages being spoken, a lot of ethnicities that exist in these cities. When it came to the cosmopolitan nature of both Istanbul and Isfahan, we'd say that Istanbul was much more cosmopolitan. There were, for example, Armenian Christians who lived in Isfahan, but Istanbul had a lot more in terms of people residing there from, Italy, Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, a little bit more cosmopolitan the Ottoman center was. And in terms of sea axis, this was also true for Istanbul. So Istanbul had equals maybe more. Isfahan equals less. Right, so less in terms of interacting with the outside world in terms of maritime exploration, and that was largely just a kind of a part of geography in some ways. There was a lot less coastline. In fact, most of the Safavid economy was based primarily on silk and carpets. These were traditionally traded overland. Silk especially was from China, really to Europe in some ways. And the Safavids were right in the middle. And by taking the silk from China to Europe, that's where the Safavids could make a lot of their money. The Safavids were also known especially for their rug making or carpet making. Carpets was, again, a way that the Safavids made a lot of money. You see an illustration of it here. You may have heard before Persian carpets. Some of that dates back to the high quality goods that were produced during this time. However, the dynasty struggled, the economy and politically. So just to go along with this, idea of the economy, when the Portuguese, right, and again, we can kind of think of this in the context of the Age of Exploration, when the Portuguese began sailing around and getting to China directly, that really did a lot to diminish this overland trade. And so it wasn't as lucrative as it was in the past, certainly as it progressed, because as time went on, more and more European ships were going directly to China and dealing there without having to do any overland trade. And, over water trade is much more efficient, much more profitable than overland trade, because it's, when you're traveling by horseback or oxen or camel, you can't carry as much. And so you can't make as much money as you can simply by ship. Also, like the Ottoman Empire, the introduction of silver helped to destabilize the Safavid economy. And then conflict. The Safavids were frequently at war, especially with their Ottoman neighbors. Again, this is Sunni and Shia. The Safavids also had a difficult time with getting their cavalry units to adopt guns, and so the Safavids essentially utilized slave soldiers. It wasn't the first time. There actually is a long history of slave soldiers in the Islamic world as being one of the primary fighting forces, but it's not quite the same. Anytime a slave soldier is used, there's always a risk that's being run by the empire doing it, because they're slaves, and they would likely probably not like that status. So again, this was to wield gunpowder weapons. It just kind of goes to show you maybe the desperation of the Shahs at the time. By this moment, Shah Abbas, after he passed away in 1629, that's kind of a good indicator of when the decline started. And lastly, in 1722, Afghan raiders captured Isfahan, and that spelled an ending to the Safavid dynasty.